David Copperfield, abridged from the novel by Charles Dickens. I was born at Blunderstone in Suffolk, although unhappily my father had died 6 months before I was brought into the world. Miss Betsy Trotwood, my aunt, was the principal source of wealth in the family, and one March afternoon, shortly before I was born, when my mother was sitting by the fire, Miss Betsy unexpectedly put in an appearance. After my mother had recovered from this unannounced visitation, Aunt Betsy asked, "What do you call your girl?" "I don't know that it will be a girl yet, ma'am," replied my mother. "I have a presentiment it must be a girl. As I intend to be her godmother, I beg you to call her Betsy Trotwood Copperfield. There must be no trifling with her affections, poor dear." When the moment arrived, Peggotty, who was to be my nurse, conveyed my mother upstairs, and the doctor was called. Later, when the doctor came downstairs and pronounced that the baby was a boy, my aunt never said a word, but put on her bonnet, fastened its strings, aimed a blow at the doctor's head, and vanishing like a discontented fairy, never to return to the house. Looking back, I can remember certain details that stand out amongst the general confusion of things at that time. My mother with her pretty hair and youthful shape, and Peggotty with no shape at all, with eyes that were dark. Her cheeks and arms were so red that I wondered that the birds didn't peck at her in preference to apples. She would sometimes open her arms wide, take my curly head between them, and give it a good squeeze. Being very plump, whenever she made any little exertion such as this, some of the buttons on the back of her dress flew off. One day, Peggotty and I answered the bell at the garden gate. There was my mother, looking unusually pretty, I thought, and with her a gentleman with beautiful black hair and whiskers, who had walked home with us from church the previous Sunday. He patted me on the head. Somehow I decided immediately that I didn't like him or his voice, and in any case I was jealous that his hand should touch my mother's. I refused him my right hand, but rather gave him my left hand, which he shook heartily, saying I was a brave fellow. Soon he went away. Even to this day I can see him turn round in the garden and give us a last look with his ill-omened black eyes before the door was shut. Whether it was the following Sunday when I saw the gentleman again, or later, I cannot recall. But there he was in church, and once again walked home with us. Gradually I became used to seeing the gentleman with the black whiskers, although I liked him no better than I had at first, and felt the same uneasy jealousy of him. One autumn morning, Mr Murderstone, I knew him by that name now, came on horseback. He took me for a ride. Looking at him closely made me think him, in spite of my misgivings, a very handsome man. We went to a hotel by the sea, where I heard a friend of his refer to my mother as the pretty little widow. "Take care, if you please," cautioned Mr Murderstone. "Somebody's sharp." And he indicated me. We walked about the cliff after that and went home early in the evening. It seems to me at this distance of time as though it were the following day that Peggotty asked if I would like to go with her to stay at her brother's at Yarmouth. But it was probably about 2 months afterwards. I was quite ready to go. It touches me now to recollect how eager I was to leave my happy home, to think how little I suspected that I was leaving forever. On the way to Peggotty's brother, we made so many deviations up and down lanes, calling at different places, that I was quite tired and very glad when we saw Yarmouth. "Here's my ham," screamed Peggotty when we reached the public house, "growed out of all knowledge." Ham was waiting for us, a huge, strong fellow. He carried me on his back down lanes until we came out on the dull waste of the shore I'd seen earlier at a distance from our carriage. Ham motioned to me. "Yon's our house, Master Davy." There was a black barge, a kind of ancient boat, standing not far off, with an iron funnel sticking out of it for a chimney which was smoking cosily. "That's it," said Ham proudly. If it had been Aladdin's palace, I suppose I could not have been more charmed with the romantic idea of living in it. So in this perfect abode, the fortnight of my stay slipped away, varied by nothing but the variation of the tide. I am always reminded, when I hear or read of the name Yarmouth, of a certain Sunday morning on the beach. The bells were ringing for church, little Emily standing there, an orphan who had been taken in by old Mr Peggotty, Ham lazily dropping stones in the water, and the sun, away at sea, just breaking through the heavy mist and showing us the outlines of the ships. At last the day came for going home. The nearer we drew to home, the more excited I was to get there, and to run into my mother's arms. The door opened, and I looked, half laughing and half crying for my mother. It was not she, but a strange servant. "Something's the matter, I'm sure. Where's Mamma?" I asked Peggotty, looking anxiously at her. "You see, dear, I should have told you before now," confessed Peggotty. "Master Davy, you've got a new pa." I trembled and turned white. Peggotty gave a gasp, and putting out her hand, said gently, "Come and see him." "I don't want to see him," I protested. "And your mamma?" I ceased to draw back, and we went straight to the best parlour. There sat my mother with Mr Murderstone. My mother rose hurriedly, but timidly. "Now, Clara, my dear," declared Mr Murderstone, "recollect, control yourself, always control yourself. Davy boy, how do you do?" I gave him my hand. After a moment I went and kissed my mother. I could neither look at her, nor could I look at him. As soon as I could, I crept upstairs to think alone. At last, in my desolation, I began to consider that I was dreadfully in love with little Emily, and had been torn away from her to come here where no one seemed to want me. This made such a miserable business of it that I cried myself to sleep that night. The following day I saw that I knew that Mr Murderstone could mould my mother's pliant nature into any form he chose. As I know now, that is exactly what he did. God help me, I might have been improved for my entire life if a kind word had come my way that season. A word of reassurance to me that it was home might have made me dutiful to him and might have made me respect him instead of hating him. Nonetheless, he seemed very fond of my mother, and she very fond of him. From what they said at dinner, I gathered that an elder sister of his was coming to stay, and that she was expected that very evening. I am not certain whether I found out then or later that he had some share in a wine merchant's house in London. Miss Murdstone duly arrived, and a gloomy-looking lady she was. She greatly resembled her brother in both face and voice. She was brought into the parlour, and formally acknowledged my mother as a new and near relation. Then she looked at me and snapped, "Is that your boy, sister-in-law?" My mother nodded. "Generally speaking," said Miss Murdstone, "I don't like boys." She extended her hand to me. "How do you do, boy?" Under these circumstances, I mumbled my reply. Miss Murdstone disposed of me in 2 words. "Wants manners." As well as I could make out, she'd come for good, and had no intention of ever going again. Firmness was the grand quality on which both Mr and Mrs Murdstone based their lives. Before long I clearly understood that it was another name for tyranny. "It's very hard," said my mother, "that in my own house—" "My own house," repeated Miss Murdstone. "In our house, I mean. I don't ask much," said my poor mother. "I'm not unreasonable. I only want to be consulted sometimes, as a mere formality. Edward, I'm sure I'm not ungrateful. I know I have many faults, but not that." I was sorry for my mother's distress. I never knew my mother afterwards to give an opinion on any matter without first appealing to Miss Murdstone. There had been some talk on occasions of my going away to boarding school. Nothing, however, was concluded on the subject yet. In the meantime, I learnt lessons at home. Shall I ever forget those lessons? Let me remember this scene. My mother is ready for me at her writing desk, but not half so ready as Mr Murdstone or as Miss Murdstone. The very sight of these two had such an influence over me that I begin to feel that the words I have been at such pains to get into my head start sliding away. Even when the lessons were done, the worst is yet to come, in the shape of an appalling sum. It seems to me at this distance of time as if my unfortunate studies generally took this course. I could have done very well if I'd been without the Murdstones. The gloomy theology of theirs made all children out to be a swarm of little vipers, and they held that children in close proximity merely contaminated one another. The presence of the Murdstones thus prevented my learning, and as a result I was warned that I must be flogged. Mr Murdstone walked me up to my room, with my head in his vice-like grip. It was only for a moment that I resisted him, for he hit me heavily an instant afterwards, and at the same time I caught his hand between my teeth and bit it through. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. He beat me then, as if he would have beaten me to death. Then he was gone, and the door was locked outside. I was lying, fevered and hot, torn and raging on the floor. The next morning, Miss Murderstone appeared and told me that I was free to walk in the garden for half an hour and no longer. I did so, and did so every morning of my imprisonment, which lasted 5 days. During the morning of the 5th day, Miss Murderstone appeared as usual and told me I was going to be sent away to school. I went down to the parlour and there found my mother, very pale and with red eyes. They had persuaded her that I was a wicked fellow, and she was more sorry for that than for me going away. I felt it sorely. I tried to eat my parting breakfast, but could not. "Master Copperfield's box there," said Miss Murderstone, when the wheels were heard at the gate. At our parting, my mother hugged me and whispered, "I forgive you, my dear boy. May God bless you." Saddened at our separation, I got into the cart. After half a mile, we stopped. Peggotty burst from her hedge and climbed in. She took me in her arms without saying a word, crammed a bag of cakes and a purse into my pockets, and then she quietly got down from the cart and ran away. When the cart reached Yarmouth, in reply to the coachman's asking if Peggotty had a sweetheart, he gave me a message to write down. So, while waiting for the coach, I procured a sheet of paper and wrote a note to Peggotty. "My dear Peggotty, I have come here safe. Barkis is willing. My love to Mamma, yours affectionately, David. P.S. He says he particularly wants you to know, Barkis is willing." The following day we reached London. What an amazing place London was to me when I saw it in the distance. I was taken to an inn, and presently a man entered and took me by the hand and led me from the office. "I take it you're the new boy?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said without hesitation. I supposed I was. I didn't know. "I am one of the masters at Salem House," he explained. "It's by Blackheath." On the way we stopped for breakfast. We then found a coach in which I was put. Inside there were no other passengers, so I slept soundly until the coach stopped. A short walk took the master and me to Salem House. All about it was very quiet, and I remarked on this. The master seemed surprised at my not knowing that it was holiday time. I gazed upon the schoolroom into which he took me before he left. It was the most forlorn and desolate place I had ever seen. I went to the upper end of the room and came across a pasteboard placard which was lying on the desk, which bore these words: "Take care of him, he bites." I got up on the desk immediately, apprehensive that there was at least a dog underneath. The master, whose name was Mr. Mell, as I found out later, came back and asked me what I was doing up there. "I beg your pardon, sir," says I. "If you please, I am looking for the dog." "Dog?" says he. "What dog?" "Isn't it a dog, sir?" I asked. "Isn't what a dog?" "That's to be taken care of, sir. That bites, as the notice says." "No, Copperfield," he says gravely. "That's a boy. My instructions are, Copperfield, to put this placard on your back, and so I must do it." With that he tied the placard to my back. What I suffered from that placard nobody can imagine. I always fancied that somebody was reading it. I recollect that I positively began to have a dread of myself, as a kind of wild boy who bit. The first boy back was Tommy Traddles. He enjoyed my placard so much that he saved me by presenting me to every boy, saying, "Look here, here's a game." The great part of the boys were not so boisterous at my expense as I had expected. They could not resist the temptation of pretending I was a dog, and patting and smoothing me lest I should bite, and saying, "Lie down, sir," and calling me Towser. I was carried before J. Steerforth, another boy who was reputed to be a great scholar and very good-looking. I told him I had 7 shillings. "You'd better give them to me to take care of," he said. I hastened to comply with his friendly suggestion. "We must make it stretch as far as we can, that's all. I'll do the best in my power for you." He kindly told me he would take care of things so that everything would be all right, and he was as good as his word. That night I heard all kinds of things about the school and all those belonging to it. "Good night, young Copperfield," said Steerforth. as I made my way upstairs. "Remember, I'll take care of you." "You're very kind," I gratefully returned. "I am very much obliged to you." I thought of him very much after I went to bed. In my eyes he was a person of great power. Poor Traddles! In a tight sky-blue suit that made his arms and legs like German sausages, he was the merriest and most miserable of all the boys. He was always being caned. He was very honourable, Traddles was, and held it as a solemn duty for the boys to stand by one another. He suffered for this on several occasions. Steerforth continued his protection of me and proved a very useful ally, since nobody dared provoke anyone whom he honoured with his friendship. However, he couldn't or didn't defend me from Mr. Creakle, the headmaster. Mr. Creakle had a little nose, a large chin, and a fiery red face. He liked to tug at my ear and announce that he was a Tartar, and all in all he was very severe with me. There was one advantage, the only one that I know of, in Mr. Creakle's severity. He found my placard in his way. When he came up or down behind the form in which I sat and wanted to make a cut at me in passing, the placard was in his way. For this reason it was soon taken off, and I saw it no more. In a school managed by sheer cruelty, whether it is presided over by a dunce or not, there is not likely to be much learnt. I believe our boys were generally as ignorant as a set of schoolboys as any that existed. They were too much troubled and knocked about to learn. They could no more learn to their advantage than any can do anything to advantage in a life of constant misfortune, torment, and worry. Steerforth's help urged me on, and although this did not save me from much in the way of punishments during the time I was there, I became something of an exception in that I steadily picked up crumbs of knowledge. In this I was much assisted by Mr. Mell, who had a liking for me that I am grateful to remember. The rest of that half-year is a jumble in my recollection of the daily life and struggle of our lives, of the waning summer and the changing seasons. I well remember, though, how the distant idea of the holidays, after seeming for an immense time to be a stationary speck, began to come towards us and grow and grow. How from counting months we came to days. I learnt from Steerforth that I had been sent for and was certainly to go home. What a strange feeling it was to be going home when it was not a home. The days when my mother and I and Peggotty were all in all to one another and there was no one to come between us rose up before me so sorrowfully on the road that I would rather have remained away. But there I was. I went softly into the parlour. My mother was sitting by the fire, suckling an infant. I wished I had died then, with that feeling in my heart. "Here is your brother," said my mother. "Davy, my handsome boy. My poor child." Peggotty came running in. I had never thought it possible that we three could be together undisturbed once more. The Murdstones were out for the day. We dined together. Then we sat round the fire and talked delightfully. We were very happy. And that evening, as the last of its kind, will never pass out of my memory. It was almost 10 o'clock before we heard the sound of wheels. My mother said that as it was so late, and Mr. and Miss Murdstone approved of early hours for young people, perhaps I'd better go to bed. From the following morning, Miss Murdstone kept a calendar of the holidays, and every morning checked off a day in exactly the same manner. She did it gloomily until she came to 10, but when she got to single figures, she became more hopeful, and as the time advanced, even jocular. From the foregoing, you will have seen that I was not a favourite of Miss Murdstone. In short, I was not a favourite there with anybody, not even with myself. For those who did like me could not show it, and those who did not showed it so plainly that I became sensitive of always appearing constrained, boorish, and dull. I felt I made them as uncomfortable as they made me. Mr. Murdstone ordered me round like a dog, and I obeyed like a dog. "I will have from you a respectful, prompt, and ready bearing towards myself," he commented, "and towards Jane Murdstone, and towards your mother. I will not have this room shunned as if it were infected. Another thing, you are not to associate with the servants. The kitchen staff will not improve you. I disapprove of your preference for such company as Miss Peggotty, and I require that it is to be abandoned." I obeyed him to the letter. I retreated to my own room no more. I took refuge with Peggotty no more. but I sat wearily in the parlour day after day, looking forward only to bedtime. Thus the holidays dragged on until the morning came when Miss Murderstone said joyfully, "Here's the last day off." I was not sorry to go, for I had by this time lapsed into a stupefied state. I kissed my mother and my baby brother goodbye. I was in the carrier's cart when I heard my mother calling to me, and I looked out to see her, and so I lost her. I pass over all that happened at school until my birthday came round in March. It was after breakfast, and we had been summoned in from the playground. I was called. David Copperfield is to go into the parlour. I hurried away as instructed, and there I found Mr. Creakle sitting at breakfast and Mrs. Creakle with a letter in her hand. "David Copperfield," said Mrs. Creakle, "I want to speak to you very particularly. I have something to tell you, my child. You are too young to know how the world changes every day, and how people in it pass away." I looked at her earnestly. "When you came away from home last, were they all well?" Mrs. Creakle said, and after a pause, "Was your mamma well?" I trembled, making no attempt to answer. "Because," she said, "I grieve to tell you that I hear this morning your mamma is very ill." Then I felt the burning tears run down my face. I now knew all. "She is dead," I cried. Mrs. Creakle was kind to me. I cried, wore myself to sleep, and cried again. If ever child was stricken with sincere grief, I was. I was to go home the next night. I left Salem House upon the morrow afternoon. I little thought then that I left it never to return. The coach stopped off at Yarmouth. I was taken to a funeral parlour to be fitted by Mr. Orme, the undertaker. He told me that my brother was dead too. My wounds broke out afresh at this intelligence. At last the morbid work was finished. The sombre chaise arrived, drawn by a black horse with a long tail. When we reached home, I was in Peggotty's arms before I got to the door, and she took me into the house. She had not been to bed, I discovered, for a long time. As long as her poor dear Pretty was above ground, she said, she would never desert her. Miss Murderstone asked if I had been measured for my mourning, and I replied I had. "And your shirts?" said Miss Murderstone. "Have you brought 'em home?" "Yes, ma'am, I have brought home all my clothes." This was all the consolation that her firmness administered to me. Her brother now very seldom spoke to her, and never to me. He seems to be the only restless thing, except the clocks, in the whole motionless house. After the funeral, Peggotty told me what had taken place. From the moment of my knowing of the death of my mother, the idea of her being as she had appeared of late vanished from me. I only remembered her as the young mother of my earliest impressions. In her death, she winged her way back to her calm, untroubled youth, and cancelled all the rest of her life. As to my future, not a word was said. At last I mustered the courage to ask Miss Murderstone when I was going back to school, and she answered she believed I was not going back at all. There was a change in my condition. The restraint which had been put on me was quite abandoned. I was never sought out or inquired for. Peggotty was given a month's notice. At this she said to me, "I'm going to my brother's first, Davy, for another fortnight's visit. Now, I've been thinking that perhaps, as they don't want you here at present, you might be let to go along with me." The idea of being again surrounded by those honest faces, shining welcome on me, made a calm of my heart. Peggotty agreed to ask Miss Murderstone if I could go. "Humph," responded Miss Murderstone. "Since it is of more importance than anything else, it is of paramount importance that my brother should not be disturbed or made uncomfortable. I suppose I'd better say yes to your request." So the permission was given. When the month was out, Peggotty and I were ready to depart. Mr. Barkis, the carrier, sat in his usual place on the cart. He shuffled near Peggotty, and I could not help observing that he seemed to think he had hit upon a wonderful expedient for expressing himself in a neat, agreeable, and pointed manner, without the inconvenience of inventing conversation. Mr. Peggotty and Ham waited for us at the old place. As we were left, Barkis called out, "I say, it was all right." "Oh," I answered, not understanding. "You know who was willing?" explained my friend. "It was Barkis, and Barkis only." Peggotty asked me what he'd said, and I told her. "Like his impudence," said Peggotty, "but I don't mind that. What should you think if I was to think of being married?" "If you were thinking of being married to Mr. Barkis, Peggotty?" "Yes." "I should think it would be a very good thing." Mrs. Gummidge, the lorn old woman, was waiting at the door. The whole place seemed quite as delightful as before, yet somehow it did not impress me in the same way. I felt perhaps this was because little Emily, whose father had drowned long ago, was not there. I presently found myself on the path outside the boat. A figure appeared before long, and her whole self was prettier than before. She seemed to delight in teasing me, for little Emily was spoiled by them all, and no one more than Mr. Peggotty himself. She was so affectionate and sweet-natured, and had such a pleasant manner, being both shy and sly at once, that she captivated me more than ever. The days passed pretty much as they'd passed before. Every evening Mr. Barkis appeared at the door, always with a little bundle of offerings which he left for Peggotty. His wooing was altogether of a peculiar kind. One day Peggotty, Barkis, little Emily, and I went on a holiday excursion. I informed little Emily, I recollect, that I never could love another. How merry she made herself about it. Peggotty and Barkis went from the coach to look inside a church, leaving us outside. After a while they rejoined us. We learnt afterwards that they were married in this interval, and had gone into the church for that express purpose. Peggotty was at first a little confused when Mr. Barkis made an abrupt announcement of their union, and could not hug me enough in token of her unimpaired affection, but soon became herself again, and said that really she was glad it was all over. I've often thought since what an odd, innocent, out-of-the-way kind of wedding it must have been. That night Mr. and Mrs. Barkis bade us goodbye and drove away to their own home. Shortly afterwards I took leave of the cottage and passed the night at Peggotty's before returning home with herself and Mr. Barkis. They left me at the gate of the house I knew so well. And now I fell into a state of neglect, which seems to cast a gloom even at this distance of time. I believe Mr. Murdstone's means were straitened at this time, but it is little to the purpose. He still could not bear me. I was not beaten or starved, but day after day, week after week, month after month, I was coldly neglected. I was seldom allowed to visit Peggotty. She, true to her earlier promise, came to see me, or met me somewhere once every week, and never left me empty-handed. During this time, the old books were my only comfort. I was out walking one day near the house when I came upon Mr. Murdstone with a gentleman. I knew him to be Mr. Quinion, whom I'd gone over to Lowestoft with Mr. Murdstone to see before. Seeing me, Mr. Murdstone came over and put his hand on my shoulder and asked me to walk with them. "He is at home at present," he said, as though I were not there. "He's not being educated anywhere, and I don't know what to do with him. He's a difficult subject." Responded Mr. Quinion. I made my way home with them, and Mr. Quinion stayed that night. Next morning Mr. Murdstone called me. Mr. Quinion and his sister were also in the room. "David," said Mr. Murdstone, "to the young this is a world of action, not for moping around in." "Stubbornness won't do here," cried his sister. "What it needs is to be crushed, and crushed it must be, shall be, too." Mr. Murdstone gave her a look and continued. "I suppose you know, David, that I'm not rich. What is before you is a fight with the world. and the sooner you begin it, the better. You've heard of the counting-house mentioned sometimes? The counting-house, sir? Of Murdstone and Grinby, in the wine trade. I think I have heard the business mentioned, sir. Mr. Quinion suggests that as it gives employment to some other boys, he sees no reason why it shouldn't, on the same terms, give employment to you. So you are now going to London with Mr. Quinion, to begin on your own account. In short, you are provided for, observed his sister, and you will please do your duty. I had little time for clearing my thoughts, as Mr. Quinion was to go out to London the next day. I know enough of the world now to have almost lost the capacity to be much surprised by anything, but had little of this knowledge when I became, at 10 years old, a labouring hand in the service of Murdstone and Grinby. The warehouse was at the waterside down by Blackfriars. It was a crazy old house with a wharf of its own and was literally run over with rats. An important branch of their trade was the supply of wines and spirits to certain packet ships. I know that a great many bottles were in use as a consequence of this traffic, and that a number of men and boys were employed to examine them against the light and to rinse and wash them. So, this work was to be my work, and I became one of the boys employed upon it. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship, and felt my hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. At 12:30 one day, Mr. Quinion beckoned to me. I found him with a stoutish middle-aged person who had no more hair on his head than there is on an egg. His face was extensive, his clothes shabby, but he wore an imposing shirt collar and a confident roll in his voice and carried a jaunty sort of stick. About him was an indescribable air of the genteel. "Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Quinion, "is known to Mr. Murdstone. He takes orders for us on commission. He has been written to by Mr. Murdstone on the subject of your lodgings, and he has agreed to receive you as his lodger." So it was later on that day I arrived at Mr. Micawber's house on Windsor Terrace. He presented me to Mrs. Micawber, a thin and faded lady with a baby at her breast. This baby was one of twins. I hardly ever, in my early experience of the family, saw both twins detached from Mrs. Micawber at the same time. One of them was always taking refreshment. There were two other children, Master Micawber, aged about 4, and Miss Micawber, aged about 3. These, and a dark woman with a habit of snorting, who was a servant to the family, completed the establishment. Mrs. Micawber explained that Mr. Micawber was a sort of traveller for a number of miscellaneous houses now, but made little or nothing from it. "If Mr. Micawber's creditors will not give him time," explained Mrs. Micawber, "they must take the consequences, and the sooner they bring it to an issue, the better." Poor Mrs. Micawber! The only visitors I ever saw or heard of were the creditors. They used to come at all hours, and some of them were quite ferocious. One man used to edge himself into the passage as early as 7 o'clock in the morning and call up the stairs to Mrs. Micawber. "Come on, I can see you ain't out yet. Pay us, won't you? You can't hide, you know." At such times as these, Mr. Micawber would be transported with grief and mortification, but within half an hour he would go out, humming a tune with greater gentility than ever. From Monday morning to Saturday night, I had no advice, no support of any kind from anyone. I was so young to undertake the entire responsibility for my own existence that often I could not resist the stale pastry put out for sale at half price at the pastry cook's doors, and spent the money I should have kept for dinner. Once I remember carrying my own bread under my arm, wrapped in a piece of paper, and going to a famous beef house and ordering a small plate of that delicacy to eat with it. What the waiter thought of such a strange apparition coming in all alone, I don't know. But I can see him now, staring at me as I ate my dinner. I gave him a halfpenny for himself, and I wish he hadn't taken it. Mr. Micawber's difficulties were in addition to the distressed state of my mind. In my own forlorn state, I became quite attached to the family, and used to walk about busily thinking of Mrs. Micawber's calculations, of ways and means, and heavy with the weight of Mr. Micawber's debts. At last, Mr. Micawber's difficulties came to a crisis, and he was arrested and taken to the Debtors Prison. At last, Mrs. Micawber informed me that her family had decided that Mr. Micawber should petition for release, which would set him free, she expected, in a matter of 6 weeks. Meanwhile, the household furniture came to be sold for the family's benefit. Who sold it, I don't know, but sold it was and carried away in a van. With the few remaining possessions, we encamped, as it were, in the 2 parlours of the emptied house in Windsor Terrace. I've no idea for how long, though it seemed to me an age. In due course, Mr. Micawber's petition was ripe for hearing, and that gentleman was ordered to be discharged under the Act to my great joy. On hearing this news, I asked Mrs. Micawber what they intended to do. "My family are of the opinion," she replied, "that something might be done for a man of his ability in the Custom House. It is their wish that Mr. Micawber should go to Plymouth." "And will you go too, ma'am?" I asked. "I will never desert Mr. Micawber. He may have concealed his difficulties from me. I recall the pearl necklace and bracelets which I inherited from my mamma being disposed of for less than half their value, and the set of coral has actually been thrown away for nothing. But I will never desert Mr. Micawber." I passed my evenings with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber during the remaining term of our residence under the same roof. On the last Sunday we were together, Mr. Micawber spoke to me confidentially. "My dear young friend, my advice to you is never do tomorrow what you can do today. Procrastination is the thief of time. My other piece of advice to you already know. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, 19 shillings and 6 pence. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 and 6 pence. Result, misery. The blossom is blighted. In short, you are forever flawed, as I am." After which he borrowed a shilling from me, gave me a written order for the amount, put away his pocket handkerchief, and cheered up. Next morning I saw the whole family off from the coach office. From there I went to begin my weary day at Murdstone and Grinby's, but no longer with any intention of passing many more days there. No, I had resolved to run away, to go, by some means or other, down into the country to the only relation I had in the world, to tell my unfortunate story to my aunt, Miss Betsy. However, as I did not know where Miss Betsy lived, I wrote a long letter to Peggotty and asked her if she remembered. In the course of that letter, I told Peggotty I had particular occasion for half a guinea. Peggotty's answer soon arrived and was full of affectionate devotion. She enclosed the half-guinea and told me that Miss Betsy lived near Dover. I decided to set out at the end of that week. 5 days later, my money was all gone. I was hungry, thirsty, and worn out. I was minus my waistcoat and jacket, which I had pawned on the way to buy food. Having slept under haystacks, one night I passed outside my old school of Salem. I was no longer a presentable sight. I went into a little shop near Dover and inquired if they could have the goodness to tell me where Miss Trotwood lived. A young woman who was being served turned round on hearing me. "My mistress," she said. "What do you want with her, boy?" "I want," I replied, "to speak to her, if you please." "To beg of her, you mean," retorted the maid. She told me I could follow her, and soon we came to a neat cottage with cheerful bow windows. With a strong consciousness of my disreputable appearance, I waited to introduce myself to my formidable aunt. I was on the point of slinking off, when there came out of the house a lady with a handkerchief tied over her cap, a pair of gardening gloves on her hands, and carrying a great knife. I knew her immediately to be Miss Betsy. "Go away," ordered Miss Betsy, shaking her head and making a distant chop in the air with her knife. "Go along! No boys here!" She marched to a corner of her garden and stopped to dig up some little root there. I went softly and stood beside her. "If you please, ma'am," I began. She started and looked up. "If you please, aunt, I am your nephew, David." "Oh, Lord!" cried my aunt, and sat flat down in the garden path. There she sat on the gravel, staring at me until I began to cry. Then she got up in a great hurry, collared me and took me into the parlour. Then she unlocked a tall press, brought out several bottles, and poured the contents of each into my mouth. I think they must have been taken down at random, for I'm sure I tasted aniseed water, anchovy sauce, and salad dressing. After a while she rang the bell. "Janet," called my aunt to her servant, "go upstairs, give my compliments to Mr. Dick, and say I wish to speak to him immediately." My aunt, with her hands behind her, paced up and down the room until the gentleman who had earlier squinted at me from the upstairs window came in, laughing. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "don't be a fool, whatever else you may be. You have heard me mention Mr. David Copperfield. Now don't pretend not to have a memory, because you and I know better. This is his boy, his son. He has run away. What shall I do with him?" "Why, if I was you," said Mr. Dick, looking vacantly at me, "I should wash him." "Janet," said my aunt, "Mr. Dick sets us all to rights. Heat the bath." Janet was a pretty blooming girl of about 19 or 20, and a perfect picture of neatness. She was one of a series of protégés whom my aunt had taken into service expressly to educate, to renounce men, and who had generally complied by marrying a baker. Janet had gone away to get the bath ready when suddenly my aunt became rigid with indignation and cried out, "Janet, donkeys!" Upon which Janet came running and darted outside to warn off 2 donkeys who were on the lawn at the front of the house. My aunt had determined her own right of way in her own mind, and the one outrage of her life was the passage of a donkey over that immaculate patch of green. The bath was a great comfort, and later I was taken up to bed like a prisoner, my aunt going in front and Janet bringing up the rear. I remember how I sat for a long time that first evening looking at the moonlight on the water. Finally I turned my eyes away and yielded to the sensation of gratitude and rest which the sight of the white curtained bed inspired. On going down in the morning, I found my aunt musing profoundly over the breakfast table. I sat blushing under my aunt's close scrutiny. "Hello," said my aunt suddenly after a long time. "I have written to him, to your father-in-law. I have told him where you are." "Oh, I can't think what I shall do," I exclaimed, "if I have to go back to Mr. Murderstone." My spirits sank, and I became very downcast and heavy of heart. My aunt, without appearing to take much heed of me, completed a number of household tasks, then sat down with her workbox. "I wish you'd go upstairs," she said after a while, "and give my compliments to Mr. Dick. I'd be glad to know how he's getting on with his memorial." Mr. Dick was a protégé whom my aunt had saved from an asylum. He was a friendly soul. He made kites, and I helped him fly them. He also spent much time writing a memorial that was never finished, because he could never square his own birthday with the date on which Charles I lost his head. In fact, I found out that Mr. Dick had been upwards of 10 years endeavouring to keep King Charles I out of the memorial, but he'd been constantly getting into it, and was there now. At length a reply from Mr. Murderstone came, and my aunt informed me, to my infinite terror, that he was coming to speak to her himself on the next day. On the following morning, my aunt was a little more imperious and stern than usual, but I observed no other signs of her preparing herself to receive the visitor. It was late when she gave a sudden alarm of, "Donkeys!" "Go along with you," cried my aunt. "How dare you trespass? Go along." In fact, it was Miss Murderstone on a donkey. She dismounted and was waiting with her brother on the steps in an instant. My aunt took no further notice of their presence until they were finally announced by Janet. "Shall I go away?" I asked, trembling. "No, sir," replied my aunt. "Certainly not." I saw Mr. and Miss Murderstone enter the room. My aunt observed Mr. Murderstone with a keen look. "You are the Mr. Murderstone who married the widow of my late nephew?" "I am." "You'll excuse me for saying, sir," returned my aunt, "that I think it would have been a much better thing if you had left that poor child alone. You were a tyrant to the baby, and you broke her heart. She was a loving child, and through the callous misuse of her weakness you gave her the wounds she died of. You begin to break her like a caged bird, and wear her life away by teaching her to sing your notes. You tormented the poor boy here, so that the very sight of him brings a disagreeable remembrance. Ah, you needn't wince, I know it's true." I noticed now that though the smile was on Mr. Murdstone's face still, his colour had gone in a moment. "Good day, sir," returned my aunt, "and good-bye, and good day to you, ma'am," she continued, turning to the sister. "Let me see you try and ride a donkey over my green again, and as sure as you have a head upon your shoulders, I'll knock your bonnet off and tread on it." At this the two visitors walked haughtily out of the cottage. Mr. Dick was called into the room. My aunt spoke. "You consider yourself guardian, jointly with me, of this child, Mr. Dick." "I shall be delighted," said Mr. Dick. "Very good," returned my aunt. "Then that's settled. From now on we will call you Trotwood Copperfield." Thus I began my new life, in a new name, and with everything new about me. Mr. Dick and I soon became the best of friends, and very often when his day's work was done we went out together to fly the great kite. "Trot," said my aunt one evening, "we must not forget your education. Should you like to go to school at Canterbury?" I replied that I should like it very much. I was in fact greatly elated by this. "Is it a large school, aunt?" I asked. "Why, I don't know," said my aunt. "We are going to Mr. Wickfield's first." For the time being I asked for no more information about Mr. Wickfield. When we reached Canterbury we stopped at a very old house bulging over the road. "Is Mr. Wickfield at home, Heap?" asked my aunt. "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Wickfield is indeed at home," replied Uriah Heep. We went into Mr. Wickfield's room. I soon found out that he was a lawyer. "What wind blows you here?" "Not an ill wind, I hope?" he asked. "No," said my aunt. "I have not come here for advice on the law." She indicated me. "This is my grand-nephew. I have adopted him and brought him here to put him into a school where he may be thoroughly well taught and well treated." "At the best we have," replied Mr. Wickfield. "Your nephew would be unable to board just now." At this he went out of the room with my aunt. They were not so successful with their inquiries as I could have wished, for though the advantages of the school were undeniable, my aunt had not approved of the boarding-houses proposed for me. "I'll tell you what you can do," said Mr. Wickfield on their return. "What's that?" inquired my aunt. "Leave your nephew here. He's a quiet fellow, and therefore he won't disturb me at all. It's a capital house for study." My aunt evidently liked the offer, though she was delicate of accepting it. So did I. And so my aunt sent me to school at Dr. Strong's in Canterbury, and Mr. Wickfield and I were cared for by his daughter Agnes, a happy, capable girl, with whom I was soon the best of friends. The other person in the house was Uriah Heep. He was a cadaverous, red-haired youth with hardly any eyebrows and no eyelashes. His red-brown eyes were so unsheltered I wondered how he went to sleep. Uriah sat late at night improving his legal knowledge so that he might one day become a solicitor. As he read, his lank forefinger followed every line, making clammy tracks along the page like a snail. "I suppose you're quite a great lawyer," I said, after watching him for some time. "Me, Master Copperfield?" replied Uriah. "Oh, no, I'm a very humble person. I'm well aware that I'm the humblest person going. My mother is likewise a very humble person. My father's calling was humble. He was a sexton. Mr. Wickfield is a most excellent man, Master Copperfield. If you have known him long, you will know it, I am sure, much better than I can inform you." I replied that I was certain he was, but that I had not known him long myself, though he was a friend of my aunt's. "Oh, indeed, Master Copperfield," said Uriah. "Your aunt is a sweet lady, Master Copperfield." He had a way of writhing when he wanted to express enthusiasm, which was very ugly. One day he confided in me that his rascally purpose was to make himself so indispensable to his master that he would become not only a partner in the firm, but the husband of the sweet Agnes, who loathed him. I felt like running a red-hot poker through his false body. Once he strove to incriminate me in a piece of rascality, so I struck him a blow to his lank jaw. His retaliation was to ask how I could do such a thing, to say that he'd always liked me, and that he forgave me. His eyes, as he then looked at me, seemed to take every shade of colour that could make the eyes ugly. "You forgive me?" I said disdainfully. "I do, and I know you can't help yourself," responded Uriah. "I will be a friend to you in spite of you." I let him know that I should expect from him what I'd always expected, the worst, and left him. But he knew me better than I knew myself. If he had openly exasperated me, it would have been a relief and a justification. But he had put me on a slow fire, on which I lay tormented half the night. One day I visited him at home. After a while, I had begun to be a little uncomfortable and to wish myself free of the visit, when a figure coming down the street passed the door. It was Mr. Micawber. I cannot say I was glad to see Mr. Micawber there, but I was glad to see him in person, and I shook hands with him, inquiring after Mrs. Micawber. "Thank you," said Mr. Micawber. "She is tolerably convalescent. She will be rejoiced, Copperfield, to renew her acquaintance with one who has proved such a worthy minister at the sacred altar of friendship." I said I should be delighted to see her, so we went off to the inn where he was staying. Mrs. Micawber was amazed at my unexpected arrival, but very glad to see me. "I thought you were in Plymouth, ma'am," I commented. "We went to Plymouth, but the truth is, they would rather not have a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities in the custom-house. In fact, our reception was so cool that only one obvious course was left, to borrow the money to return to London. But it is clear that a family of 6 cannot live upon air." "Certainly, ma'am," I said. "The opinion is," continued Mrs. Micawber, "that Mr. Micawber should turn his attention to the coal trade. Nothing, as yet, has turned up. We are presently waiting for a remittance from London to discharge our pecuniary obligations at this hotel." I felt the utmost sympathy for Mr. and Mrs. Micawber. When I took leave of them, they both pressed me to dine with them before they went away, and that I could not refuse. We had a beautiful dinner. Mr. Micawber was so convivial, I never saw him such good company. In a word, I never saw anybody so thoroughly jovial as he was, down to the last moment when I took a hearty farewell of himself and his amiable wife. Consequently, I was not prepared the next morning to receive the communication from Mr. Micawber which stated that there was now no hope of the remittance. I was so shocked I ran towards the little hotel immediately, but halfway there I met the London coach, with Mr. Micawber within and Mrs. Micawber sitting at the back. So, with a great weight off my mind, I returned to school. I am doubtful whether I was at heart glad or sorry when my school days drew to an end. My aunt and I had held many grave deliberations on the calling to which I should be devoted. Mr. Dick had regularly assisted at our councils. He never made a suggestion, except one, when he suddenly proposed that I should be a brazier. "I tell you what," said my aunt one morning towards Christmas, "as this knotty problem is still unsettled, suppose you were to take a little journey in the meantime." "Of all the things in the world, aunt, I should like it best." "Well," continued my aunt, "that's lucky, although it is but natural and rational that you should like it." "I hope so, aunt." "I shall therefore send you upon your trip to London on your own." I was shortly afterwards fitted out with a handsome purse of money, together with a portmanteau, and tenderly dismissed upon my expedition. I took a seat upon the box of the London coach. We went to the Golden Cross at Charing Cross, then a mouldy sort of establishment in a close neighbourhood. Here I was left. A waiter showed me into the coffee-room, and a chambermaid introduced me to my small bedchamber. After dinner I ordered wine. I thought it flat, but I was bashful enough to drink it and say nothing. Being then in a pleasant frame of mind, I resolved to go to a play. It was Covent Garden Theatre I chose, and there I saw Julius Caesar. I came out into the rainy street at 12 o'clock at night. The unceremonious pushing and shoving I then received put me on the road back to the hotel, whither I went recalling the glorious vision that I had just seen on the way. I was so filled with the play that I was not sure when the figure of a handsome, well-built young man, who was also in the hotel, became a real presence to me. At last, I rose to go to bed, and in going towards the door, I once again passed this person. I went up to him and said, "Steerforth, you don't remember me, I'm afraid." "My God," he suddenly exclaimed, "it's little Copperfield. I knew you immediately. You're so easily remembered. Well, I am on an expedition of duty, for my mother lives but a little way out of town. I decided to remain here tonight instead of going on." He invited me to breakfast the next morning at 10 o'clock. I found him snug in a private apartment. "Now, Copperfield," said Steerforth, "I should like to hear what you are doing, and where you are going, and all about you. I feel as if you were my own property." Glowing with pleasure to find that he had still this interest in me, I told him how my aunt had proposed the little expedition that I had before me, and where I intended to go. "As you appear to be in no hurry, then," he suggested, "come home with me to Highgate and stay a day or two. You will be pleased with my mother, and she will be pleased with you." Lunch succeeded sightseeing, and it was dusk when the stagecoach stopped at an old brick house at Highgate on the summit of the hill. It was a genteel, old-fashioned house, very quiet and orderly. I met Steerforth's mother and her companion, a strange creature named Rosa Dartle. Rosa had black hair, eager black eyes, a scar on her lip, and she was very thin. I asked Steerforth if Miss Dartle was clever, and he said that she was all edge. "What a remarkable scar that is on her lip," I mentioned. Steerforth looked uncomfortable at this, and then admitted that he had done it. As a young boy, Rosa had exasperated him, and so he threw a hammer at her. A promising young angel I must have been. Before dinner was done, Mrs. Steerforth was speaking to me about my intention of going down to Suffolk. On a whim, I said how glad I should be if Steerforth would go there with me, and explaining to him that I was going to see my old nurse and Mrs. Peggotty's family. I reminded him of the boatman he'd seen when they'd visited the school. "Oh, that bluff fellow," said Steerforth. "He also had a son with him, hadn't he?" "No, that was his nephew," I replied, "whom he adopted as a son. He has a pretty niece, too, whom he adopted as his daughter." "It would be worth the journey," said Steerforth, "to see those sort of people together in their boat and to be one of them." "Those sort of people," exclaimed Miss Dartle. "Are they really animals and clods and beings of another order?" "Why, there's a pretty wide divide between them and us," replied Steerforth with indifference. The rest of the week passed away in a most delightful manner. It went rapidly, and yet it gave me so many occasions for knowing Steerforth better and admiring him more in 1,000 respects that at its close I seemed to have been with him for a much longer time. He made up his mind to go with me to the country, and the day arrived for our departure. We went down by the mail, going straight to bed on our arrival and breakfasting late on the following morning. I then gave Steerforth minute directions for meeting me at Mr. Barkis's residence and went out alone. I called on Mr. Omer and his daughter Minnie. Mr. Omer spoke of Emily. "When she got a situation," said Mr. Omer, "to keep a fractious old lady company, they didn't agree very well, and she didn't stop. At last she came here, apprenticed for 3 years. Nearly 2 of them are over, and she's been as good a girl as ever was. Worth 6 of any other girls." I had no doubt that she was close by, and Mr. Omer nodded at my asking. Looking through the glass in the door of the parlour, I saw her sitting at her work. When I saw her, she seemed the most beautiful creature with cloudless blue eyes that had ever looked into my childish heart. I was too bashful to step in and speak to her, but I acquainted myself with the hour at which she left of an evening, in order that my visits might coincide. Taking leave of Mr. Omer, I went on to my dear old Peggotty's. There she was, in her tiled kitchen, cooking dinner. "Peggotty," I cried at her. She exclaimed, "My darling boy!" and we both burst into tears, and were locked in each other's arms. What a pride she showed, what joy! I had never laughed and cried in all my life more freely than I did that morning. I learnt that Mr. Barkis was unwell with the rheumatics. "Barkis will be so glad at your coming," said Peggotty. "It'll do him more good than pints of lineament." So I went upstairs with her, and having waited for a minute outside the door, presented myself to the invalid. He received me with absolute enthusiasm. A slow rheumatic smile crossed his face. He said that he did not regret having been willing to marry Peggotty. Then he asked his wife to get me a good dinner, turned us out of his room, and endured unheard-of agonies in crawling out of bed alone and taking a guinea from its hiding-place. He groaned on until he had got into bed again, still suffering, no doubt, from his martyrdom. Then he called us in, pretending to have just woken from a brief, refreshing sleep, and produced the guinea from under his pillow, with which to pay for my entertainment. Peggotty informed me that the carrier's illness had resulted in his becoming a little more near than before. It was not long before Steerforth arrived. His easy, spirited good humour, his genial manner, his handsome looks, and his natural gift of getting directly to the point of interest in anybody's heart bound him to Peggotty in 5 minutes. He stayed for dinner there with me, and we made merry in the little parlour. He maintained all his delightful qualities to the last until we started forth at 8 o'clock for Mr. Peggotty's boat. A murmur of voices had been audible from the outside, and at the moment of our entrance there was a clapping of hands. Little Emily saw us first. She was springing from the arms of the great, bashful, lumbering, kindly Ham into those of Uncle Peggotty, who was beaming with delight. Ham shouted to us, "Master Davy! It's Master Davy!" In a moment we were all shaking hands with one another and asking one another how we did. Mr. Peggotty was so proud and overjoyed to see us that he didn't know what to do or say, but kept over and over again shaking hands with me. I thought I'd never seen Ham, the boat builder, grin to anything like the extent to which he now grinned at us, while Mr. Peggotty explained how little Emily and Ham had just become engaged. I thought it affecting to see such a sturdy fellow as Ham was now, trembling in the strength of what he felt for the pretty little creature who had won his heart. But it was Steerforth who touched the prevailing chord, and he did it with such address that in a few minutes we were all as easy and as happy as it was possible to be. "Mr. Peggotty," he said, "you are a thoroughly good fellow, and deserve to be as happy as you are tonight. I give you joy, my boy. Daisy, stir the fire, and make it a brisk one. And, Mr. Peggotty, unless you can induce your gentle niece to come back, I fear I shall have to go. Any gap at your fireside on such a night, such a gap least of all, I wouldn't make for the wealth of the Indies." So Mr. Peggotty went to fetch little Emily back. Presently she was brought to the fireside, very much confused and very shy, but she soon became more assured when she found how gently and respectfully Steerforth spoke to her. Indeed, Emily said little all evening, but she looked, and when she listened her face became animated and she was charming. Steerforth told us stories, and little Emily laughed until the boat rang with the musical sounds, and we all laughed in irresistible sympathy with what was so pleasant and light-hearted. I could not satisfy myself whether it was in her own little tormenting way, or in a maidenly reserve before us, that she kept quite close to the wall and away from Ham. But I observed that she did so all evening. We parted merrily, and as they all stood crowded round the door to light us as far as they could upon the road, I saw Emily peeping after us and heard a little voice calling after us. "A most engaging little beauty," said Steerforth. "How fortunate," I replied, "for us to have arrived to witness their happiness for their intended marriage. I never saw people so happy." "He's a rather chuckle-headed fellow for that girl, don't you think?" asked Steerforth. I was shocked by this unexpected and cold comment, but seeing a laugh in his eyes, I was much relieved. We stayed for more than a fortnight in that part of the country. We were very much together, but occasionally we went our separate ways for hours at a time. I knew Steerforth's restless nature and bold spirits, delighted to find a vent in rough toil and hard weather, so none of his interest in boating during this time surprised me. Another cause of our sometimes being apart was that I had naturally an interest in going over to Blunderstone and revisiting the old familiar scenes of my childhood. Hence, on 3 or 4 days that I recall, we went our separate ways after an early breakfast and met again at a later dinner. I had no idea how he employed all his time in the interval, beyond a general knowledge that he was very popular in the place, and had 20 means of actively diverting himself where another man might not have found one. One dark evening, when I was later than usual, I found Steerforth alone in Mr. Peggotty's house, sitting thoughtfully before the fire. He gave such a start when I put my hand on his shoulder that he made me start too. "You come upon me," he said almost angrily, "like a reproachful ghost." "Have I called you down from the clouds?" I asked. "No," he answered. "I've been sitting here thinking that all the people we found so glad on the night of our arrival might be dispersed, or dead, or come to I don't know what harm. David, I wish to God I had had a judicious father these last 20 years. I wish with all my soul I had been better guided. I wish with all my soul I could guide myself better." There was a passionate dejection in his manner that quite startled me. He told me that he had that day bought a boat to sail in the neighbourhood, and that he was going to have her rechristened. "By what name?" I asked. "The little Emily," he replied, gazing out of the window. "But look, here comes the original little Emily, And that fellow with her, eh? Upon my soul, he's a true knight. He never leaves her for a moment. Emily withdrew her hand timidly from Ham's arm as we stepped outside to speak to them, and blushed as she offered it to Steerforth and me. When they had passed by, she walked by herself. I thought all this very pretty and engaging. Suddenly, there passed us, evidently following the couple, a young woman. She was lightly dressed. She looked bold and haggard and poor. After a short time, her figure disappeared from view, but still no nearer to them than before. "That is a black shadow to be following that girl," said Steerforth, standing still. "What does it mean?" Later I was surprised when I came to Mr. Barkis's house to find Ham walking up and down in front of it, and still more surprised to learn from him that Emily was inside. I asked him why he wasn't inside too. He replied, "It's a young woman, sir, a young woman that Emily knowed once, and don't ought to know no more. It's a poor woman, Master Davy, as is trod under foot by all the town. Her name is Martha Endall, 2 or 3 years older than Emily, but was at the school with her." We walked up and down for a minute or two in silence. The door opened then, and Peggotty appeared to be beckoning to Ham to come in. I followed. Not a word was spoken when we first went in. Eventually Emily spoke. "Martha wants to go to London," she said to Ham. "What will she do there?" inquired Ham. "She will try to do well," replied little Emily. "You don't know what she said to us." "I'll try," said Martha, "if you'll help me away. I never can do worse than I've done here, and I may well do better. Oh, take me out of these streets where the whole town knows me from a child." As Emily held out her hand to Ham, I saw him put in it a little canvas bag. She took it and made a step or two forward. The tears rose freshly in her eyes, and she whispered something to Martha and asked whether that was enough. "More than enough," said the other, and took Emily's hand and kissed it. Then Martha rose, making a low, dreary moan in her shawl, and went on her way. When the door had closed, little Emily glanced up at us and then hid her face in her hands. "Don't, Emily," pleaded Ham. "It doesn't ought to cry so pretty." "Oh, Ham," she exclaimed, still weeping pitifully. "I'm not as good a girl as I ought to be. I know I have not the thankful heart sometimes as I ought to have. But I am happy at the sight of you, and I am happy all day long in the thoughts of you," replied Ham touchingly. I saw Emily do that night what I'd never seen her do before. I saw her innocently kiss her chosen husband on the cheek, and creep close to his bluff form as if it were her best support. When I awoke the next morning, I thought very much of little Emily. While at breakfast, a letter was delivered to me from my aunt. It was time for the journey home, and so we departed to the regret of all concerned, and left a great many people very sorry behind us. On my return home, my aunt followed up on the subject of her letter. When the supper table was cleared, she began, "Well, what do you think of the plan to be articled? Or have you not begun to think about it yet?" "I have thought a good deal about it, my dear aunt, and I have talked a good deal about it with Steerforth. I like it very much indeed." "Well," said my aunt, "that's cheering." Then she spoke of the arrangement and cost. She continued, "All is agreed and understood between us now, and we need talk of this no more. Give me a kiss, and we'll go to the Commons after breakfast tomorrow." At about midday the next day, we set off for the offices of Messrs. Spenlow and Jorkins in Doctors' Commons. My aunt had agreed to pay my principal, Mr. Spenlow, £1,000 to have me articled. She had a general opinion that in London every man she saw was a pickpocket, and so she gave me her purse to carry for safekeeping. A few dull courts and narrow ways brought us to the offices of Spenlow and Jorkins. Mr. Spenlow was fetched and came hurrying in. As he spoke, I was dismayed by the description of his terrible partner, Jorkins. But I found out afterwards that he was a mild man, but of a heavy temperament. It was settled that I should begin my month's probation, articled in law, as soon as I pleased. Days and weeks slipped away, and I was duly articled to Spenlow and Jorkins. I had an allowance of £90 a year from my aunt. My rooms were paid for 12 months in advance. A week or two after I was articled, Mr. Spenlow asked if I would do him the favour of coming down and staying with him in the country. It was a very pleasant journey going down, during which Mr. Spenlow gave me some hints in reference to my profession. I listened to all this with attention. We went into the house, which was cheerfully lit. "Where is Miss Dora?" asked Spenlow of the servant who greeted us. Dora, I thought. What a beautiful name. We turned into a room near at hand, and I heard Mr. Spenlow's voice say, "Mr. Copperfield, may I introduce my daughter Dora, and Dora's confidential friend?" It was all over in a moment. I had fulfilled my destiny. I was both a captive and a slave. From the first moment that I saw her, I loved Dora Spenlow to distraction. She was more than human to me. She was a fairy and a sylph. I wallowed in an abyss of love from that first instant. "I have seen David Copperfield before," observed a well-remembered voice. The speaker was Dora's confidential friend, Miss Murderstone. A bell rang, which Mr. Spenlow said was the first dinner bell, so I was obliged to go off to dress. I could only think of the captivating, girlish, bright-eyed, lovely Dora. What a form she had, what a face she had, what a graceful, enchanting manner. I don't remember who was there at dinner except Dora. I have not the least idea what we had for dinner. All I could think of was Dora. My impression is that as I dined I was only aware of Dora, and sent away 6 plates untouched. That night I went to bed in a most maudlin state of mind, and got up in a crisis of feeble infatuation. It was a fine morning, and I thought I would take a stroll before breakfast. I had not been walking long when I turned a corner and met Dora. I never saw such curls. How could I? For there never were such curls as those she shook out to hide her blushes. "You are not very intimate with Miss Murderstone, are you?" asked Dora. "No," I replied. "Not at all so." "She is a tiresome creature," commented Dora, pouting. "I can't think what Papa can have been about when he chose such a vexatious thing to be my companion. Who wants a protector, anyway? I'm sure I don't want one." Miss Murderstone came looking for us and found us. She took Dora's arm in hers and marched us into breakfast. How many cups of tea I drank because Dora made it, I don't know. But I perfectly remember that I sat swilling tea until I felt my whole nervous system, if I had any in those days, must have gone by the board. We had a quiet day. Miss Murderstone sat with her homily before her, with her eye on us, keeping guard vigilantly. Mr. Spenlow and I departed early the following morning. Once back in the sleepy old court, I had daydreams about Dora. I don't mean that I dreamt on that day alone, but day after day, week after week, and from term to term, I walked miles daily in the hope of seeing her. I now became secretary to my old tutor, Dr. Strong, and began to write in earnest. Great was the labour, priceless the reward. Dora must be won at all costs. I learned shorthand and induced my friend Traddles, whom I had found studying for the bar, to recite the parliamentary debates so that I might take them down as he spoke. The inconsistency and recklessness displayed by Traddles in his recollections of Parliament as he obliged me was not to be exceeded by any real politician. About this time I visited Steerforth again, before setting out once more to see my friends at Yarmouth. That evening I went with Steerforth into his room to say good night. "Good night," said I. "My dear Steerforth, I shall be gone before you wake in the morning." "Good night." He was unwilling to let me go, and stood holding me with a hand on each of my shoulders. "If anything should ever separate us, you must think of me at my best, old boy. Come, let us make a bargain. Promise you will think of me at my best if circumstances should ever part us." "You have no best to me, Steerforth," said I, "and no worst. You are always equally loved and cherished in my heart." We shook hands and parted. I was up with the dull dawn, and in that silent hour I left him. Nevermore. Oh, God forgive you, Steerforth, was I to touch that passive hand in love and friendship. Never, nevermore. I got down to Yarmouth in the evening. I first called upon Mr. Omer and his daughter. The report was that Mr. Barkis was as bad as could be, and that he was quite unconscious. Hearing this, and learning that Mr. Peggotty was there, I determined to go to the house at once. I bade good night to Mr. Omer, and directed my steps towards Peggotty's. My low tap at the door was answered by Mr. Peggotty. Little Emily was sitting by the fire with her hands to her face. Anne was standing near her. "This is very kind of you, Master Davy," said Mr. Peggotty. Soon I was upstairs, where Peggotty took me in her arms, sobbing that Mr. Barkis had always liked me and admired me, that he had often talked of me before he fell into a stupor, and that she believed, in case of his coming to himself again, He would brighten up so at the sight of me. When I saw him, the probability of his ever doing so appeared to me to be very small. Time and the world were slipping from beneath him. He was mute and senseless. "He's going out with the tide," said Mr. Peggotty to me as I came downstairs. "People can't die along the coast except when the tide's pretty nigh out. If he lives till it turns, he'll hold his own till past the flood and go out with the next tide." "Barkis, my dear," cried Peggotty from the bedroom. We rushed upstairs. "Look, here's Master Davy," said Peggotty. For now Barkis had opened his eyes. I was on the point of asking him if he knew me, when he stretched out his arm and said to me distinctly with a pleasant smile, "Barkis is willing." And, it being low water, he went out with the tide. It was not difficult for me, at Peggotty's request, to decide to stay where I was until the remains of the poor carrier should have made their last journey to Blunderstone. I did not dress up in mourning to attend the funeral, but rather I walked over to Blunderstone and was in the churchyard when the procession came. A dread falls on me here. I cannot bear to think of what was to come upon that memorable night. Nothing can undo it. My old nurse was to go to London with me the next day on the business of the will, and we were all to meet in the old boathouse that night. It was a wild night, and the rain was falling heavily. Soon I was within sight of Mr. Peggotty's house. A little floundering across the sand brought me to the door, and I went in. There they all were, just as if they had never been disturbed, and only Ham and Emily were missing. Ham came in shortly, wearing a large sou'wester hat slouched on his face. "Where's Emily?" asked Mr. Peggotty. Ham did not move, but said, "Master Davy, will you come out a minute?" We went out. As I passed him, I saw to my astonishment and fright that he was deadly pale. "Ham, what's the matter?" "Master Davy," he began. Oh, for his broken heart! How dreadfully he wept! I was paralyzed by the sight of such grief. "Ham, poor good fellow, for heaven's sake, tell me what's the matter." "My love, Master Davy, her what I'd have died for, and would die for now. She's gone." "Gone?" "Emily's run away. Oh, Master Davy, when I think how she's run away, I beg my good and gracious God to kill her sooner than let her come to ruin and disgrace." The face he turned to the troubled sky, the quivering of his clasped hands, the agony of his figure remain in my memory to this hour. I saw the door move and Mr. Peggotty thrust forth his face, and never could I forget the change that came upon it when he saw us, if I were to live 500 years. I remember a great wail and cry, and once more we were all now standing in the room, I with a paper that Ham had given me, a blotted letter from which, in the midst of the silence of death, I read, "You have loved me so much better than I have ever deserved, even when my mind was innocent. When you see this, I shall be far away. It will be never to come back unless he brings me back a lady. If only you that I have wronged so much can ever find it in your heart to forgive me, I wish that you could only know what I suffer." Mr. Peggotty then murmured in a low voice, "Who's this man? I want to know his name." Ham glanced at me. I felt shocked. "Master Davy," exclaimed Ham, in a broken voice, "it ain't no fault of yourn, but his name is Steerforth, and he's a damned villain." Mr. Peggotty uttered no cry, only pulled down his coat from a corner. Ham asked him where he was going. "I'm going to seek Emily. I'm a-going first to stave in that there boat and sink it where I would have drowned him, and I'm going to seek my niece through the world. I'm going to find her and bring her back. No one stops me." The news of what happened soon spread through the town. As I passed along the streets next morning, I overheard the people speaking of it at their doors. It was on the beach I found the group. They looked worn out. As I glanced at Ham, who was then looking out to sea, a frightful thought came into my mind. I recall an expression of stern determination in Ham's face. I could see that if he ever encountered Steerforth, he would kill him. The following morning I was joined by Mr. Peggotty and my old nurse, and we went to the coach office, where Mrs. Gummidge and Ham were waiting to take leave of us. "Master Davy," Anne whispered, while Mr. Peggotty was stowing his luggage. His life is quite broken up. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know what's afore him. I'm sure you'll be a friend to him, Master Davy. Trust me, I will indeed, I promised. In London, Mr. Peggotty and I saw Mrs. Steerforth. She announced that her son could not marry Emily. It is impossible. Such a marriage would irretrievably blight my son's career and ruin his prospects, but let him go where he will, with the means that my love has given to him. She observed that it was useless to discuss the position any further, and she begged to put an end to the interview. Mr. Peggotty remarked, I have no more to say, ma'am. I came here with no hope, and I take away no hope. This has been too evil a house for me and mine. With this we departed. Mr. Peggotty told me that he now meant to set out on his travels. I asked him where he meant to go. He only answered, I am going, sir, to seek my niece. That night he took a small amount of ready money, and he promised to communicate with me. He slung his bag about him, took his hat and his stick, and bade us both good-bye. All good attend you, dear old woman, he said, embracing Peggotty. He said this solemnly, then went down the stairs from my lodging and away. Mr. Spandau told me one day that in a week it would be Dora's birthday, and he would be glad if I would come down and join in a picnic on the occasion. I think I committed every possible absurdity in preparation for this event. When I arrived, I saw Dora in the garden. There was a young lady with her, whose name was Miss Mills. You will be glad to hear, Copperfield, said Dora, that cross Miss Murderstone is not here. She's gone away to attend to her brother's second marriage, and will be away for at least 3 weeks. Isn't that delightful? I said I was sure it must be delightful to her, and all that was delightful to her was delightful to me. I was sensible of a mist of love and beauty about Dora, but nothing else. I was happier than ever when the party broke up. On our return we reached Norwood, and so we parted. I rode all the way to London with the farewell touch of Dora's hand still present on mine. When I woke the next morning, I resolved to declare my passion to Dora, and know my fate. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I did it in a moment. I had Dora in my arms, and I was full of eloquence. I never stopped for a word, but I told her how much I loved her. I told her I should die without her. Well. Dora and I were sitting on the sofa by and by, quiet enough. It was a load off my mind, and I was in a state of perfect rapture. Dora and I were engaged. What an idle time it was! What an unsubstantial, happy, foolish time it was! I wrote to Agnes as soon as Dora and I announced our engagement. To this letter I received an answer by return of post. As I read it, I seemed to hear Agnes speaking to me. It was as though her cordial voice was in my ears. What more can I say? When I returned one day to my chambers, Peggotty and I were both very much surprised to find my aunt there with Mr. Dick. I knew my aunt sufficiently well to know that she had something of importance on her mind. She asked me, Have you become firm and self-reliant? I hope so, Aunt. Then, my love, announced my aunt, all I have in the world is in this room, except for the cottage, and that I have had to let. I am ruined. She wept. Then in a moment added in a tone more triumphant than dejected, We must meet these reverses boldly, and not suffer them to frighten us. We must live our misfortune down. From that time she was extremely gracious to Peggotty, and appeared quite at home. She was to have my bed, and I was to lie in the sitting-room, to keep guard over her. How miserable I was then, when I lay down. How I thought and thought about my being poor in Mr. Spenlow's eyes. The following morning I explained the circumstance to him. I then went to Mr. Jorkins. He concluded the interview by saying, What you wish to be done, I'm afraid, can't be done. This in reference to my request for the cancellation of my articles. In a state of despondency I left the office. The next day I was not dispirited. What I had to do was to turn the painful discipline of my younger days to account, by going to work with a resolute and steady heart. With new life came new purpose, new intention. It was a great labour, and priceless the reward. Dora was the reward, and Dora must be won. My first care was to see Dr. Strong. I had heard from Agnes, Mr. Wickfield's daughter, that he was in further want of his secretary. I obtained the position. I was pretty busy now, up at 5 in the morning and home at 9 or 10 at night, but I had infinite satisfaction in being so closely engaged, and felt the more I tired myself, the more I was doing to deserve Dora. On seeing Traddles, he told me that he had had a letter from Mr Micawber, written in his characteristically lofty style, that contained surprising news. At last, something had turned up. I was glad to find that Mr Micawber had got rid of his dust and ashes and went to see him that very evening. I expressed my opinion that he was indeed going in the right direction. "It may be a sacrifice," said Mrs Micawber, "to immure oneself in a cathedral town." "Oh, you are going to a cathedral town?" I asked. Mr Micawber replied, "To Canterbury, in fact, my dear Copperfield. I have entered into arrangements by virtue of which I stand pledged and contracted to our friend Heep to be his confidential clerk." We then fell into some general conversation. Mr Micawber wrote an IOU and placed it in the hands of Traddles, and said he wished him well in every relation of life. I am persuaded that this was quite the same to Mr Micawber as paying the money, and that Traddles himself hardly knew the difference until he had time to think about it. We parted with great heartiness on both sides. I did not allow my resolution to cool. It might have been heartbreaking but for Dora, who was the stay and anchor of my tempest-driven bark. One day, Miss Murderstone provided an obstacle to my plans when she seized and laid my love letters to Dora before Mr Spenlow. He ordered me to think no more of his daughter from then onwards, an order which I refused to obey. I confided all to my aunt when I got home, and in spite of all she could say to me, I went to bed despairing. I got up despairing and went to the Commons despairing. The clerks were there, but nobody was doing anything. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Don't you know about Mr Spenlow?" said old Tiffy. "What about him?" "He's dead." "Dead?" "He dined in town, then drove his phaeton by himself. The phaeton arrived home without him, so the house was roused, and went back along the road. They found him a mile off, dead." I cannot describe the state of mind into which I was thrown by this intelligence. The shock of such an event happening so suddenly is easily intelligible to anyone. In this troubled state of mind, I went down to Norwood that night. Dora was overcome with grief, and so she remained for 6 weeks. Soon after the funeral, Dora went to Putney, where 2 maiden sisters of Mr Spenlow lived. Miss Mills kept a journal in which she noted her friendship with Dora, and she used to meet me sometimes on Putney Common to read it out or lend it to me. During this time, Miss Mills and her journal were my sole source of consolation. My aunt made a pretence of being anxious that I should go to Dover, to see that all was working well at the cottage which was let. Since it provided a means to spend a few tranquil days with Agnes, I was pleased to go. I found everything in satisfactory order at the cottage, and slept there for 1 night. I walked over to Canterbury early the following morning. Arriving at Canterbury, I went to Mr Wickfield's house, and there, in the little tower room, was Mr Micawber plying his pen with great assiduity. He was extremely glad to see me. He told me he had become the tenant of Uriah Heep's old house. I saw an uneasy change in Mr Micawber, which sat tightly on him, as if his duties were a misfit. Eventually I took leave of Mr Micawber, and searched out Agnes. She looked up with such a heavenly face, and gave me her hand, which I kissed. I spoke. "Whenever I have not had you, Agnes, to advise me and approve of my actions, I have seemed to go wild, and get into all sorts of difficulty. When I have come to you, I have come in peace and happiness." I felt so deeply what I said that my voice failed me, and I covered my face with my hands and broke into tears. She soon won me from this weakness, and led me on to tell her all that had happened since our last meeting. Agnes was very kind, and I felt so grateful to her. She advised that I write to the 2 old ladies who were caring for Dora, and so I wrote the letter that very afternoon at Agnes's desk. That evening, Mr Wickfield, Uriah Heep, and I were left alone after dinner. Uriah Heep proposed the toast. "I'm an humble individual to give you her health," proclaimed Uriah, "but I admire, nay, adore her. Agnes Wickfield is, I feel it safe to say, the divinest of her sex. May I speak out? To be her father is a proud distinction, but to be her husband... Spare me from ever again hearing such a cry as that which our father gave as he rose up from the table. I implored Mr Wickfield to calm himself a little. I may have effected something, or his wildness may have spent itself, for after a while he struggled less. "I know," he said, My darling child, and you, I know. But look at him!" He pointed to Uriah, pale and glowering in the corner, evidently taken by surprise. "Look at my torturer," he cried. "Before him I have step by step abandoned name and reputation, peace and quiet, house and home. Oh, what have I come down to be, Trotwood, since I first saw you in this house? I have infected everything I have touched." He dropped to his chair, sobbing. Agnes came through to comfort him. "It's nothing," said Uriah, turning to me. "I'll be friends with him tomorrow. It's for his own good. I'm humbly anxious for his good." I gave him no answer and went upstairs. Late that night, Agnes came in to see me. "Since you'll be going early tomorrow, let us say goodbye now." Her face was calm and beautiful. "Heaven bless you," she said. The following day I left as dawn was breaking. The next morning my aunt read my letter to the two ladies, approved it, and I posted it. I left the doctor's one snowy night, and, taking a short-cut, I came face to face with Mr. Peggotty. He told me he had crossed to France, but although he had heard of Emily, he had not found her, and had travelled home. From his breast pocket he took out a small paper bundle containing 2 or 3 letters, which he laid out on the table in the inn. With each letter was some money in notes. Little Emily had written asking him to relent towards a miserable girl. "What answer did you send?" I inquired of Mr. Peggotty. "Mrs. Gummidge," he replied, "not being a good scholar, sir. Ham kindly drawed it out, and she made a copy on it. They told her I was gone to seek her, and what my parting words was." One of the letters had come by post, and this he showed me. It was postmarked from a town on the Upper Rhine, and he tracked his course on a map he laid before me. I asked him how Ham was. "He's never been heard to complain, but my sister's belief is as it has cut him deep." Then he gathered up the letters. "Well," he said, "having seen you tonight, Master Davy, I shall be away betimes tomorrow morning." He rose. I went with him, noticing a figure dart away as we went out. I parted from him on the Surrey shore and returned to the inn yard, but the figure had gone. At last an answer came from the 2 old ladies. They presented their compliments to Mr. Copperfield and informed him that if he would do them the favour to call upon a certain day, they would be happy to hold some conversation on the subject raised in my letter. Having dispatched his affirmative reply, Mr. Copperfield fell into a condition of strong nervous agitation. Traddles accompanied me on the visit. I had the vague sensation of being on view when the maid let us into a quieter drawing-room. "Pray," said one of the little ladies dressed in black, "be seated." I was all attention when any one of the sisters spoke. My sister Lavinia, being conversant with matters of this nature, will state what we consider most calculated to promote the happiness of both parties. "Our niece's position is much changed by our brother Francis's death," stated Miss Lavinia. "We have no reason to doubt, Mr. Copperfield, that you are a young gentleman possessed of good qualities and honourable character, and that you have an affection for our niece." I replied that nobody had ever loved anybody else as I loved Dora. "It seems to us," she continued, "prudent to bring these feelings to the test of our own observation. At present we know nothing of them, and are not in a situation to judge how much reality there may be in them. Therefore we are inclined to accede to Mr. Copperfield's proposal and to admit his visits here." "I shall never, dear ladies," I exclaimed, "forget your kindness." The times and conditions were then proposed, and I expressed my acknowledgments in the warmest manner. Of course, my aunt was immediately made acquainted with the successful outcome of the conference. She was happy to see me happy. During this time I observed that the postman brought 2 or 3 letters every morning for Uriah Heep, who remained at Highgate, and that these were always directed in a business-like manner by Mr. Micawber, who now assumed a round legal hand. I was glad to infer from this that Mr. Micawber was doing well, and subsequently was much surprised to receive a letter from his amiable wife, which said that her husband had felt he had sold himself to the devil, with the harrowing consequence that one formerly so domesticated was becoming alienated from her. On the slightest provocation, it would seem, he now expressed a wish for separation. I do not feel that I could give any recommendation other than she should try and reclaim Mr. Micawber by patience and kindness. But this letter set me thinking about him very much. Let me now pause during this memorable period of my life. Weeks, months, seasons pass along. I have attained the dignity of 21. I've also come out in another way, for I've taken to authorship. Now I am regularly paid for pieces and altogether am well off. We have removed to a pleasant little cottage. My aunt, however, is not going to remain here, but intends moving herself to a still more tiny cottage close at hand. What does all this portend? My marriage? Yes, I'm going to be married to Dora. Miss Lavinia and Miss Clarissa have given their consent. I'm in a dream, a flustered, happy, hurried dream. I can't believe that it is really going to be. Sophie arrives at the house of Dora's aunts in due course. I have brought Agnes by the Canterbury coach, and she has shown a great liking for Traddles. Next day we all go in a flock to see the house. I've never seen my aunt in such a state. She's amazing. Peggotty is ready to go to church, intending to watch the ceremony from the gallery. Mr. Dick, who is giving my darling to me at the altar, has had his hair curled especially. Traddles presents a dazzling combination of cream colour and light blue. The church is calm enough, I am sure, but it might be a steam power loom in full action for the sedative effect it has on me. I'm far too far gone for that. The rest is more or less an incoherent dream. At last, the ceremony over, we drive away together, and I awake from the dream. I can believe it at last. It is my dear, dear little wife beside me, whom I love so well. Are you happy now, you foolish boy? Asks Dora. And sure you don't repent? It was a strange condition of things when I found myself sitting down in my own home with Dora. At first it seemed such an extraordinary thing to have Dora always there. One day she asked, "Will you call me a name I want you to call me?" "And what name is it?" I asked with a smile. "It's a stupid name," she said. "Child wife." I laughingly asked my child wife what her fancy was in desiring to be so called. She answered, "I don't mean, silly fellow, that you should use the name instead of Dora. I only mean that you should think of me that way. When you are angry with me, say to yourself, 'It's only my child wife.'" I had not been serious with her, having no idea that she was serious herself. But she was soon to prove herself my child wife. For Dora was incapable of running a home, of managing servants, nor of dealing with tradespeople who always robbed us. She could not understand figures nor my literary work. She admitted that she was a little goose, and told me that it was useless for me to try and make her wise. If criticized, she hid her face in my shoulder in a profusion of tears and curls. So after a while I gave up the attempting to suit her for control of our home, and never afterwards remonstrated with her for her lack of system or her untidy ways. During this time I visited Mrs. Steerforth, and learnt that although she had heard from my former friend, it had not restored his sense of duty nor natural obligation. Reflecting on this, I felt it right that this news should be communicated to Mr. Peggotty, who was in London that day. "Mr. Peggotty," I said, "don't expect much, but I have heard some news. It gives no clue as to where she is, although she is not with him. I believe she's still alive." Thank ye, kind sir," he said. "If she should make her way to London, which is likely, she won't go home." "If she should come here," I said, "I believe there is one person more likely to discover her than any other. Do you remember Martha?" "I have seen her in the streets." "You say you have seen her. Do you think you could find her?" "I think, Master Davy, I know where to look." "It is dark now, but since we are together, shall we go out and try to find her tonight?" He assented. We were not far from Blackfriars Bridge when Mr. Peggotty turned his head and pointed to a solitary female figure flitting about along the opposite side of the street. I knew it to be the figure we sought. We followed at a distance, never losing sight of her, but never caring to come very close, as she was frequently looking about. She went on a long way. It was evident she was going to a fixed destination. We were in the narrow waterside street by Mill Bank before we came up with her. The neighbourhood was a dreary one at that time, as oppressive, sad, and solitary by night as any about London. The girl we had followed strayed down to the river's brink and stood looking at the water. I had her arm within my grasp. "Martha," I said. She uttered a terrified scream. When she raised her frightened eyes and saw who it was, she dropped down between us. "Oh, the river," she cried passionately. "I know it's like me. I know that I belong to it. I feel that I must go with it." I've never known what true despair was except in the tone of those words. I assured her she was innocent of the disappearance of little Emily and of corrupting her. Mr. Peggotty asked if she would help in the search for little Emily, and that we trusted her. I then wrote out our 2 addresses and gave the paper to her. I asked her where she lived herself. She said, after a pause, that she lived in no place long, and it were better not to know. She would not take any money to help her. Then she pressed Mr. Peggotty's hand and went away along the desolate road. We followed her at a short distance until we came back into the lighted and populous streets. I laboured hard at my book, and when it came out, it was very successful. However, I retained my self-respect, so that the more praise I got, the more I tried to deserve. I pursued my vocation with confidence. By then I had been married, I suppose, about 1.5 years. After several varieties of experiment, we'd given up the housekeeping as a bad job. The house kept itself. I talked to Dora on subjects which occupied my thoughts. No matter how I endeavoured to form my little wife's mind, I could not help seeing that she became prey to the keenest apprehensions. I persevered even for months. Finally, however, I saw that I had achieved nothing, and it began to occur to me that perhaps Dora's mind was already unchangeable. On further consideration, this appeared so likely that I abandoned my scheme altogether. The old, unhappy feeling pervaded my life, and if anything, it was deepened. However, it was as undefined as ever, and came to me like a strain of sorrowful music faintly heard in the night. I loved my wife dearly and was happy, but the happiness I had vaguely anticipated once was not the happiness I enjoyed, and there was always something wanting. She was truly fond of me, and proud of me. When Agnes wrote a few earnest words on her letters to Dora of the pride and interest with which my old friends heard of my growing reputation and read my book, Dora read them out to me with tears of joy in her bright eyes and said I was a dear, old, clever, famous boy. I know now that my own heart was undisciplined when it first loved Dora, and that, if it had been disciplined, it never could have felt when we were married what it had felt in its secret experience. It remained for me to adapt myself to Dora, to share with her what I could and be happy. This was the discipline I tried to bring to my heart when I began to think realistically. It made my 2nd year much happier than the first, and what was better still, made Dora's life all sunshine. But as the year wore on, Dora was not strong. I began to carry her downstairs every morning and upstairs every night. My aunt, the best of nurses, would trudge after us, a moving mass of shawls and pillows. We made quite a gay procession of it, and my child wife was the most cheerful there. But sometimes, when I took her up and felt that she was lighter in my arms, a dead, blank feeling came upon me, as if I were approaching some frozen region yet unseen, that numbed my life. I received a letter one morning from Mr. Micawber, which, making due allowance for his lofty style of composition, indicated that something important lay behind it. He invited Charles and I to meet him at my aunt's house. We proceeded there, where Mr. Micawber was in low spirits. My aunt eyed him attentively. I saw that a crisis was at hand, and it came. Mr. Micawber burst into tears. "My dear Copperfield," he said, "this is an occupation requiring an untroubled mind and self-respect. I cannot perform it. It is out of the question." "Mr. Micawber," said I, "what is the matter? Pray speak out. You are among friends." "Among friends, sir," repeated Mr. Micawber. "Good heavens, it is principally because I am among friends that my state of mind is what it is. What is the matter? What is not the matter? Villainy is the matter. Baseness is the matter. Deception, fraud, conspiracy are the matter. The name of the whole atrocious mass is heap." We all started up. I tried to calm Mr. Micawber, but he wouldn't hear a word. He urged us to meet him a week from that day in Canterbury, and with this rushed out of the house, leaving us in a state of excitement, hope, and wonder that reduced us to a condition little better than his own. By this time, some months had passed since the interview with Martha. Nothing had yet come of her zealous intervention. I confess I began to despair of Emily's recovery and to sink into the belief that she was dead. I was walking alone in the garden, the 2nd evening in Mr. Micawber's week of suspense, when I happened to see a figure dressed in a plain cloak. It was Martha, and she had a message. Having sent for Mr. Peggotty to meet us, we took a coach to Golden Square. We entered a house which swarmed with inmates. We two proceeded to the top story of the house. As we turned to ascend the last flight of stairs to the roof, we caught sight of a female figure pausing for a moment at the door. Then it went in. I knew her. I recognized her with amazement as Rose Dartle. We went up to the door. pushed it open with a touch, and saw there was another communicating door, standing partly open. I could only see that the room beyond seemed pretty large. I could not see Miss Dartle or the person whom we heard her address. We listened. "It matters little to me her not being at home," said Rose Dartle. "I know nothing of her. It's you I've come to see." "Me?" replied a soft voice. At the sound of it a thrill went through my frame, for it was Emily's. "I have come to see," said Miss Dartle, "James Steerforth's Fancy, the girl who ran away with him, and is the talk of the town of the commonest people. The bold, flaunting, practised companion of persons like James Steerforth. I came because I want to know what such a thing is like." A frightened murmur was the only reply that reached my ears. I did not know what to do. I felt I had no right to be present, and that it was for Mr. Peggotty alone to see her and recover her. "Oh, for heaven's sake, spare me!" exclaimed Emily. "Whoever you are, you know my pitiable story." Miss Dartle placed herself in a chair, within view of the door. She sat looking down at Emily, who had dropped on her face before the imperious figure. "Here," she said, stretching out a hand with a contemptuous laugh, "is a worthy cause of diversion between a lady mother and gentleman's son. Of grief in a house where she wouldn't have been admitted as a kitchen girl. Of anger and repining and reproach. This piece of pollution picked up from the waterside, to be made much of for an hour, then tossed back to her original place." "No, no," cried Emily. "If you live in his home and know him, you know perhaps what his power over a weak, vain girl might be. I don't defend myself, but I well know he used all his power to deceive me, and that I believed him, I trusted him, and loved him." "You love him? You?" Rose Dartle cried, with her clenched hand quivering. She slowly, very slowly, broke into a laugh. "She love?" she raged. "That carrion?" Her mockery was worse than her undisguised anger. What shall I do?" exclaimed the wretched Emily. "Do?" returned the other. "Live happily on your own reflections. If this will not do, die. There are doorways and dust heaps for such deaths and such despair. Find one, and take your flight to heaven." A tread on the stairs came nearer. I knew, I was certain, it was Mr. Peggotty. Thank God. The foot upon the stairs came nearer, passed us, and rushed into the room. "Uncle!" cried Emily. A moment later I looked in and saw Mr. Peggotty supporting little Emily's insensible figure. "Master Davy," he said, "I thank God my dreams come true. He has guided me to my darling." It was early on the following day that Mr. Peggotty came to see me and told the story. Little Emily had been taken away to the continent and was then deserted. She had made her way to London and was penniless on her arrival. Martha had found her and had attended to her. Then she'd come to find me. At the end of the tale we all remained silent until I spoke. "You have made up your mind?" I asked Mr. Peggotty, "as to the future?" "Quite, Master Davy," he returned, and told Emily. Our future life lay over the sea. No one can't reproach my darling in Australia. We will begin a new life over there. In about 6 weeks or 2 months from now, there will be a sailing. He said his sister would take care of Ham, and he would give Mrs. Gummidge an allowance. He forgot nobody. He asked if I might go with him the following day to see Ham. Consequently, the next morning we were on the Yarmouth coach. After a stroll about the town, I went to Ham's house. Peggotty had now moved here for good, and I found them in the kitchen, accompanied by Mrs. Gummidge, who had been fetched by Mr. Peggotty. All next day Mr. Peggotty was occupied in disposing most of his possessions, only packing some for London. I met Ham on the sands. I told him I could write a message for him for Emily if he wished. I think there is something I could wish said or wrote. I beg of her to forgive me if I have impressed my affections on her. I loved her too deep to be able to convince her that in my own self as I'm still a happy man. But if you, Master Davy, could think of anything to say as might bring her to believe I wasn't greatly hurt, still loving her and mourning for her, anything as might bring her to believe as I was not tired of my life, I should ask you to say that, with my prayers for her that was so dear to me. I pressed his manly hand and told him I would do this as best I could. With a slight wave of his hand he turned away. When I entered the boathouse, I found it emptied of all its furniture. The wind, although it was low, had a solemn sound and crept around the deserted house with a whispering, wailing that was very mournful. Everything was gone. I thought of myself lying here when that first great change was being wrought at home. I thought of the blue-eyed child who had enchanted me. I thought of Steerforth, and a foolish, fearful fancy came upon me of his being at hand and liable to meet me at any moment. My aunt, Mr. Dick, Traddles, and I went down to Canterbury and put up at the hotel where Mr. Micawber requested us to await him. As it approached nearer and nearer to 9:30 the following morning, our restless expectation of Mr. Micawber increased. At the first chime of the half-hour he appeared in the street. "Now, sir," said my aunt to Mr. Micawber, "we are ready for Mount Vesuvius or anything else. As soon as you please." "Under the circumstances, madam and gentlemen," said Mr. Micawber, "you will do me the favour to submit yourselves to the direction of your fellow man. Though crushed out of his original form by individual errors and the cumulative force of a combination of circumstances, we have perfect confidence in you, Mr. Micawber," I said, "and will do what you please." He asked that we go to the office of Wickfield and Heap 5 minutes after he left. We did so, and found Mr. Wickfield and Uriah Heep already there. Agnes was ushered in, and I noticed Uriah watch her as she greeted us. On a sign from Mr. Micawber, Traddles left the room. "Don't wait, Micawber," ordered Uriah. Mr. Micawber stood erect before the door. "What are you waiting for?" asked Uriah, irritated. "Why do you wait?" "Because in short, I choose to do so," replied Mr. Micawber. "You are a dissipated fellow, as the world knows," stated Uriah, "and I am afraid you'll oblige me to get rid of you. Go along. I shall speak with you shortly." "If there is a scoundrel on this earth," said Mr. Micawber, "with whom I have already talked too much, that scoundrel's name is Heap." Uriah fell back as if he'd been struck or stung. At that moment Traddles came into the room with Mrs. Heap. "What do you want here?" demanded Uriah. "I am the agent and friend of Mr. Wickfield, sir," said Traddles, "and I have a power of attorney from him in my pocket." Uriah revealed his malice, insolence, and hatred. The leer with which he exulted in the evil he had done took even me by surprise, who had known him so long and disliked him so heartily. I saw the rage with which he felt his powers over Agnes slipping away. I was shocked at the mere thought of her having lived an hour within sight of such a man. He spoke. "So you think it justifiable, do you, Copperfield, to sneak about my place, eavesdropping with my clerk? You don't think at all of what I shall do in return, or of getting yourself into trouble for conspiracy and so forth. Very well, we shall see. Why don't you make Mr. Micawber speak?" At this provocation, Mr. Micawber now burst forth and produced from his pocket a foolscap document. He read out the contents and made his accusations. Uriah had deluded and plundered his kindly employer, the father of Agnes, in every conceivable manner, forged his signature, falsified the accounts, misappropriated my aunt's property, and had even induced his master to make the business over to him. Mr. Wickfield had believed himself bankrupt, and his sole reliance was upon the monster in the garb of a man who, by making himself indispensable to him, had managed his destruction. Mr. Micawber proceeded. "I have now concluded. It merely remains for me to substantiate these accusations, and then, with my ill-starred family, to disappear from the landscape on which we appear to be an encumbrance. That is soon done, for England, home and beauty, remaining always Wilkins Micawber." Uriah threw open the doors of the iron safe which stood in the room. It was empty. "Don't worry," said Traddles. "The books are now safely in my possession. I will take care of them under the authority I mentioned. Until everything is done to our satisfaction, we shall maintain possession of these things, and compel you to keep to your own room and hold no communication with anyone." "I won't do it," said Uriah with an oath. "On second thoughts, Maidstone Jail is a safer place of detention," observed Traddles. "Copperfield, will you go round to the Guildhall and bring a couple of officers?" Mrs. Heap began to speak. "Mother, hold your noise," ordered Uriah. "Well, let 'em have the deed of relinquishment. Go and fetch it." Mrs. Heap not only returned with the deed, but with a little box in which we found a banker's book and other papers that were useful afterwards. Uriah was held in safekeeping, watched over by Mr. Dick. The remainder of us went home with Mr. Micawber. His home was not far off, and Mr. Micawber bolted in, exclaiming, "Emma, my love, the cloud is passed from my mind. Mutual confidence, so long preserved between us, is restored, to know no further interruption. Now, welcome poverty, welcome misery, homelessness, welcome hunger, rags, tempest, and beggary, for mutual confidence will sustain us to the end." With this, he embraced the family all round. Following this display of emotion, my aunt mused a while and then said, "Mr. Micawber, what a good thing it would be for yourself and your family if you were to emigrate now." "Capital, madam, capital," urged Mr. Micawber gloomily. "Capital," cried my aunt. "But you have done us a great service, for much will come out of the fire. What could we do for you that would be half so good as to find the capital? There are some people David knows going out to Australia shortly. You may help each other. Think of it. The climate is the finest in the world. There is no better opening anywhere for a man who conducts himself well and is industrious." "Precisely," said Mrs. Micawber. "It is absolutely clear to me. Australia is the legitimate sphere of action for Mr. Micawber." Shall I ever forget that moment? For Mr. Micawber was the most sanguine of men. I am now once again with Dora in our cottage. I do not know how long she has been ill. Did I know then that my wife-child was soon to leave me? They have told me so, but I am far from sure that I had taken the truth to heart. I hold her hand in mine. I see her love for me alive in all its strength. I lay my face upon the pillow by her, and she looks into my eyes and speaks very softly. "I am afraid, dear, I was too young. It would perhaps have been better if we had only loved each other as boy and girl. I have begun to think I was not good enough to be your wife." Through my tears I told her she was as fit to be my wife as I was to be her husband. We have been very happy together, my sweet Dora. Is it lonely downstairs? Very. Very. Don't cry. Is my chair there? In its old place. Oh, how my poor boy cried. Hush. Hush. Now, make me one promise. I want to speak to Agnes. So please send her up to me, and while I speak to her, let no one come in, not even your aunt, for I want to speak to Agnes quite alone. Agnes is downstairs, so I give her the message. She disappears. How the time drags. "Oh, Agnes," I cried, when she reappeared. That face, so full of pity and grief, that rain of tears, that awful mute appeal to me. "Agnes, it is over. Darkness comes before my eyes, and for a time all things are blotted out of my remembrance. I came to think that the future was walled up before me, that the energy and action of my life were at an end. When it was first proposed that I should go abroad, or how it came to be agreed among us that I was to seek restoration of my peace in change and travel, I do not distinctly know. The soil now covered all that could perish of my departed wife. I waited only for what Mr. Micawber called the final pulverization of Heap, and for the departure of the emigrants. My aunt, Agnes, and I returned to Canterbury. Mr. and Mrs. Micawber had by now decided to emigrate. The arrangements being amicably settled, Mr. Micawber gave Mrs. Micawber his arm, and glancing at the heap of books and papers lying before Traddles on the table, took their leave. Traddles mentioned that Mr. Micawber and Mr. Dick had been remarkable in the assistance they had given in respect to the investigations. He announced that Mr. Wickfield was solvent once again, but the residue being so small, something further had to be done. Agnes consented to take on the future with her father, renting the house and keeping the school herself. Traddles also announced that he had recovered my aunt's £5,000 worth of investments, and added that Uriah Heep and Mrs. Heep had departed by one of the London night coaches. We came to the matter of Mr. Micawber's financial position. Traddles explained the total of his IOUs. Between us, we agreed to advance a small payment to Mr. Micawber, and that his family should have their passage and their outfit paid for together with £100. To this I added that we should let Mr. Peggotty know of Mr. Micawber, and give him a further £100 for safe keeping on his behalf. Shortly afterwards this business was all agreed by the principals themselves, with goodwill and harmony, and so this closed the proceedings of the evening. Next day we returned to my aunt's house. The time was fast drawing on for the sailing of the emigrant ship to Australia, and my good old nurse came up to London. I was constantly with her and her brother and the Micawbers, but Emily I never saw. So I thought I would write to Emily, since she might wish to send some parting word by me to her unhappy lover, and I thought to give her the opportunity. I had my letter sent round in the morning, requesting Mr. Peggotty to hand it to her. Next day little Emily sent me an answer. "How can I thank you," she wrote, "for your good and blessed kindness to me? When I am reminded of what you are, and of what Uncle is, I think what God must be, and can cry to him. I am thinking," said I to Mr. Peggotty, "that I'll go down to Yarmouth, since there's time to spare before the ship sails. I am restless, and shall be better in motion. I'll go down tonight." That evening I started out. There had been a wind all day, and it was rising all the time. In another hour it had much increased and started to blow really hard. As the night advanced, sweeping gusts of rain came up before this storm, like showers of steel. Reaching Yarmouth, I put up at the Old Inn and went down to look at the sea. I saw not only the boatmen, but half the people of the town, braving the fury of the storm to look out to sea. Not finding Ham there, I made further inquiries and learned that he had gone to Lowestoft to meet some sudden exigency in which his skill was required. So I returned to the inn, where the howl and roar of the wind, the rattling of the doors and windows, the apparent rocking of the very house, and the prodigious tumult of the sea were more fearful than in the morning. For hours I lay listening to the wind and water. At 8 I heard a shot from a cannon, and there came a knock at my door. "A wreck, close by. Make haste, sir, if you want to see her," someone shouted. At this I wrapped up and made my way down to the shore. There I looked out to sea and could see nothing but the foamy heads of the great waves. Then I plainly saw the wreck. I understood from the boatman that she was parting amidships. As he spoke there was a great cry of pity from the beach. The ship rolled and dashed like a desperate creature driven mad. 2 men were gone. The agony on shore increased. I found myself one of those, frantically imploring a knot of sailors whom I knew, not to let those 2 lost creatures perish before their eyes. They were making out to me that the lifeboat could do nothing, and that as no man would be so desperate as to wade in with a rope, there was nothing left to try. Then I saw the people part, and Ham came breaking through them. I ran to him. His look awoke me to the knowledge of his danger. I held him back. "Master Davy," he cried, grasping me, "if my time is come, 'tis come. Lord above bless you, and bless all. I'm a-going off." Ham watched the sea, until there was a great retreating wave, when, with a backward glance to those who held the rope which was made fast around his body, he dashed in after it and was gone. And now he made for the wreck. The distance was nothing, but the power of the sea and the wind made the swim deadly. He was so near when a high, green, vast hillside of water moved towards the shore. He seemed to leap up into it with a mighty bound. At that moment the ship was gone. Consternation was on every face. They drew him to my very feet, insensible, dead. He was carried to the nearest house. He'd been beaten to death by the great wave, and his generous heart was killed forever. As I sat beside his bed, a fisherman whispered my name at the door. "Sir," he said, "would you come over yonder?" Leaning on the arm he held out to support me, I asked him in a terror-stricken voice, "Has a body come ashore?" "Yes." He led me back to the shore. One of those figures from the ship had struck me with the fright of recognition. When I came to this figure, I saw him lying with his head upon his arm as I'd often seen him lie at school. No need, O Steerforth, to have said, when we last spoke together, "Think of me at my best." I had done that always, and could not change now, even looking at this sight. They took him to the cottage where death was already present. I was anxious to discharge my duty to Steerforth's mother as soon as I could. So upon a mellow autumn day about noon I arrived at Highgate. The house, when I came up to it, looked just the same as when I was last there. I asked to see Mrs. Steerforth. She was in his room. At her chair, as usual, was Rosa Dartle. The earnestness of my manner and the tears in my eyes alarmed Mrs. Steerforth. "My son is ill?" she asked. Very ill. Have you seen him then? I have. Are you therefore reconciled? In that moment I blurted out, He is dead. Rosa went up to Mrs. Steerforth. Her eyes gleamed and she broke into a frightful laugh. Now, she said, is your pride appeased, you mad woman? Now has he made atonement to you? With his life? Look at me. Look here, striking the scar. Look at your dead child's handiwork. Moan for what you made him, not for your love. I tell you that the time was when I loved him better than you ever did. All this time Steerforth's mother remained unchanged. Miss Dartle then turned to me. A curse upon you, she spat. It was an evil hour that you ever came here. Go. No longer afraid of leaving her, I turned back. Later in the day I returned with the body and we laid him in his mother's room. She was just the same as before, like a statue. All the world seemed dead and silent, broken only by this mother's moaning. 2 days later I went down to Gravesend, where I found the ship bound for Australia, surrounded by a crowd of smaller boats. I hired a boat and went on board. Mr. Peggotty was waiting for me, saying that Mr. Micawber's debts had now been paid and he was no longer liable to arrest. I noticed a young woman in black with Mrs. Gummidge stooping over to arrange Mr. Peggotty's goods. Is there any last word, Master Davy? Asked Mr. Peggotty. Is there one forgotten thing afore we parts? One thing, said I. Martha. Heaven bless you, you good man. Take her with you. She answered for him with a burst of tears. I then wrung his hand, for the time of departure had arrived. I embraced him and hurried away. We lay at a distance to see off the ship, and there 3 cheers broke from all the craft around. Then I saw her, at her uncle's side, and he pointed to us as we rowed away. She saw us, and waved her last goodbye to me, and so they solemnly passed from sight. Night had fallen on the Kentish hills by the time we were back on shore. It was a long and gloomy night that gathered in on me, haunted by the ghosts of many hopes, of many dear remembrances, many errors, many unavailing sorrows and regrets. I went away from England not knowing even then how great the shock was that I had to bear. My health, seriously impaired when I left England, was eventually quite restored. I had seen much in 3 years' travel, and although they seemed long in aggregate, they were short as they went by. My home was very dear to me, and Agnes too. But she was not mine. Was she ever to be mine, I wondered. I landed in London on a wintry autumn evening, and one of the first things I discovered was that Traddles had married. The following day I went down to see my aunt, and when we were left alone, talked far into the night. I inquired after Agnes. You will find her, replied my aunt, as good, as beautiful, as earnest as she has always been. If I knew of higher praise, I would bestow it on her. Next morning I rode out early, and the well-remembered route was soon covered. At the door, Agnes's beautiful eyes met mine as she came forward to greet me. Dear Agnes, what happiness it is to me to see you once again. I clasped her in my arms. I loved Dora fondly, as you know. Yes, she cried earnestly, I am glad to know it. Even then my love would have been incomplete without your sympathy. I had it, and it was perfected. When I lost her, Agnes, what should I have been without you? I went away, dear Agnes, loving you, and now I return home, still loving you. There is just one thing I must say, she replied. Dearest, what is it? She laid her gentle hands on my shoulders and looked calmly into my eyes. I have loved you all my life. I have always loved you, she said simply, and then laid her lovely head upon my breast and wept, and I wept with her. We arranged to be married within a fortnight. As time passed, I advanced in fame and fortune, and had been married 10 years when I received an unexpected visit from Mr. Peggotty. He told me how they had fared upon the other side of the world. The news of Steerforth's end and the death of Ham in trying to save him had changed Emily much. but she had come through so that she might have married well. But, Uncle, she said to Mr. Peggotty, that's gone forever. She's cheerful along with me, said he. Retired when others is by, fond of going any distance to tend a sick person or to do some kindness at a girl's wedding. Patient, loved by young and old alike. That's Emily. And Mr. Micawber, I asked. I learned that Mr. Micawber had flourished in Australia so that he was now a magistrate. Mr. Peggotty lived with us for just under a month. Before he left to return to Australia, he went with me to Yarmouth to see a little tablet put up in memory of Ham. While I was copying the plain inscription for him, I saw him stoop and gather up a tuft of grass and a little earth from the grave. This is for Emily, he said. I promised, Master Davy.